The Heinkel He 111 wasn't just a bomber, it was a shadow in the skies that haunted early World War II. Sleek, glass-nosed, and deceptively modern, it became the spearhead of Hitler's blitzkrieg strategy. To America, still watching the conflict from across the Atlantic, the He 111 represented both mystery and menace. What did the United States really think of this German war machine? The answer is more complex than you might expect. When American observers first saw the Heinkel He 111 in the late 1930s, they weren't looking at an obvious bomber. Its streamlined fuselage, elliptical wings, and glazed greenhouse nose gave it the profile of a futuristic airliner rather than a lumbering warplane. US military attachés in Europe initially described it as handsome but underwhelming, believing it too elegant to deliver significant payloads. That miscalculation would soon prove dangerous. By 1937, reports of the He 111's combat debut during the Spanish Civil War began filtering back to Washington. American newspapers ran black-and-white images of shattered cities like Guernica, often captioning the destruction with references to new German bombers. The aircraft's identity wasn't always clear to the public, but intelligence officers knew the He 111 had been central to the Luftwaffe's strategy of terror bombing. The first impression among American military planners was skepticism. How could a plane that looked more like a passenger transport carry the weight of sustained aerial warfare? Early technical assessments questioned its defensive armament, noting the limited number of machine guns. Some US analysts even suggested that it would be easy prey for fast modern fighters. Yet the He 111's range, bomb capacity, and rugged construction were underestimated. America's initial impressions, shaped by partial information and wishful thinking, set the stage for surprise. They believed the He 111 was more showpiece than warhorse. By the time the aircraft's true role became clear, Britain was already under siege, and American perceptions began to shift from doubt to alarm. In 1940, as London burned under relentless bombing raids, the Heinkel He 111 became infamous in American living rooms. Though the US had not yet entered the war, the Battle of Britain dominated radio broadcasts and newsreels. The image of sleek German bombers droning in formation across English skies struck both fear and fascination. For many Americans, the He 111 was the visual embodiment of Nazi aggression. American newspapers sensationalized the aircraft, often exaggerating its invincibility. Headlines referred to it as Hitler's flying fortress, a cruel twist considering the US would later christen its own bomber, the B-17, with the same title. Photographs of bombed-out homes, charred streets, and families huddled in shelters circulated widely, with captions tying the devastation directly to the He 111's payloads. The bomber became not just a machine of war, but a symbol of indiscriminate destruction. Yet, public perception wasn't entirely rooted in fear. Some American commentators viewed the He 111 as an ominous but flawed weapon. Reports trickled across the Atlantic of RAF fighters shooting them down in droves, of their weak defensive guns and limited maneuverability. Editorials reassured readers that German air power was formidable but not unstoppable. Hollywood, too, took note. Wartime documentaries produced before US entry often featured silhouettes of the He 111, casting it as the villain in aerial reenactments. Its distinctive glass nose became instantly recognizable, shorthand for Nazi bombing power. For ordinary Americans, the He 111 was both nightmare and curiosity. It was proof that technology could erase the safety of oceans. But it also became the first tangible evidence that Nazi Germany's war was everyone's concern, not just Europe's. If you think the headlines were dramatic, wait until you see what America's intelligence discovered behind closed doors. While the public saw the He-111 through headlines and propaganda reels, American intelligence agencies were dissecting it through hard data. By the early 1940s, detailed reports from Britain and intercepted German documents began landing on US desks. These assessments revealed a far more formidable aircraft than initially believed. Captured airframes provided crucial insights. British forces recovered several downed He-111s during the Battle of Britain and shared technical evaluations with their American counterparts. Engineers marveled at its adaptability. What appeared to be a sleek medium bomber was, in fact, a highly versatile platform. The He-111 could carry nearly 2 tons of bombs, operate in varied weather conditions, and perform as both a torpedo bomber and transport. American analysts noted its resilience. Crews reported that He-111s often returned to base riddled with bullets yet still airworthy. This durability challenged the stereotype of German designs as overly complex and fragile. Intelligence summaries warned US planners not to underestimate the aircraft's operational toughness. Still, weaknesses stood out. Evaluations highlighted poor defensive arcs. The dorsal and ventral gun positions left blind spots easily exploited by Allied fighters. Speed was respectable but not superior. By 1942, newer American fighters like the P-38 Lightning could outrun and outclimb it. Reports concluded that while the He-111 was effective in mass formations, it was vulnerable when isolated. Most importantly, US intelligence recognized the He-111's psychological value. Its presence symbolized blitzkrieg's terrifying speed. Analysts cautioned that the bomber's real strength wasn't just payload, it was the terror it spread across civilian populations. America's view shifted. The He-111 wasn't just a machine, it was a tool of intimidation, and one the US needed to prepare against. For US pilots, the Heinkel He-111 transitioned from newspaper headline to real roaring adversary once American forces entered the European theater. Initial encounters occurred in North Africa, where Luftwaffe bombers struck Allied convoys and desert airstrips. To American fighter squadrons flying P-40 and P-38s, the He-111 quickly proved itself less glamorous than the Zero or Messerschmitt Bf-109, yet no less deadly. American pilots noted the He-111's persistence. Even when strafed or set ablaze, the bomber's rugged airframe often held together long enough for crews to release payloads. Reports described situations where a He-111, heavily damaged, pressed through anti-aircraft fire to complete its run before crashing into sand or sea. Such determination gave US airmen both respect for its design and loathing for its effectiveness. Over Italy and later in France, interception stories multiplied. US Mustang and Thunderbolt pilots found He-111 formations easier to cut apart than newer German bombers like the Ju-88. But dangerous nonetheless. A squadron report from 1943 described the He-11-1 as clumsy under pressure but dangerous when in numbers. Lone aircraft fell quickly. Entire formations required careful tactics. American bomber crews had their own perspective. Flying daylight raids over Europe, they sometimes encountered He-111s repurposed as night raiders or supply transports. Though no longer frontline bombers, they remained a thorn. Gunners reported their awkward silhouettes against moonlight, still dropping bombs over Allied positions long after newer German models had taken precedence. To American combat veterans, the He-111 was an aircraft of contradictions, outdated yet enduring, vulnerable yet stubbornly lethal. Facing it firsthand erased earlier dismissals. It might not dominate the skies like a fighter, but it could still wound, kill, and disrupt with grim persistence. And if you think facing the He-111 in combat was tough, America's pilots had even sharper words about its legacy. By mid-war, American perspectives on the He-111 had crystallized into a paradox of grudging admiration and outright mockery. On one hand, pilots, engineers, and strategists acknowledged its toughness. On the other, they derided its aging design, increasingly mismatched against the rapid pace of aerial innovation. Military assessments described the He-111 as a bomber past its prime. Compared with the US B-17 Flying Fortress or B-24 Liberator, its payload was modest, its speed unimpressive, and its defensive firepower inadequate. American airmen joked that German crews flying them were riding museum pieces into battle. Intercept pilots even coined nicknames, calling it the Flying Cigar because of its stretched fuselage and distinctive silhouette. Yet behind the ridicule was respect. Engineers at Wright Field, where captured aircraft were tested, remarked on its clever design solutions. The elliptical wings gave stability, while its robust undercarriage enabled rough field operations. One US test pilot noted, "It may not look like much, but it's built to get the job done." That practicality resonated with Americans who valued function over form. Among the public, dual opinions spread through media. Wartime propaganda posters often caricatured the He-111 as a sinister machine of destruction, amplifying its role in bombing civilian cities. At the same time, editorial cartoons sometimes mocked it as outdated, implying that Nazi Germany's arsenal was faltering. This mix of fear and derision mirrored America's confidence in its own air power. The He-111 had once seemed terrifying. Now it symbolized German decline. Yet beneath the jokes lay recognition. It had carried the Luftwaffe's war on its back for years. America laughed at it, but only because the He-111 had already earned their respect. To America, the Heinkel He-111 was never just aluminum, engines, and bombs. It was a symbol. Throughout the early 1940s, the aircraft became a recurring villain in US propaganda, shaping how both soldiers and civilians perceived Nazi power. Newsreels routinely highlighted the bomber's role in the destruction of Warsaw, Rotterdam, and London. American audiences watched grainy footage of formations releasing bombs, followed by collapsing buildings and terrified civilians. The message was clear. This machine embodied Nazi cruelty. The He-111 was cast as the faceless enforcer of Hitler's will. Radio broadcasts amplified this perception. Announcers described waves of Heinkels blackening the skies, deliberately evoking dread. It didn't matter whether the footage or commentary featured Ju-88s or Dorniers. The He-111 became the shorthand for German terror bombing. Its distinctive greenhouse nose, endlessly reproduced in illustrations, helped cement the association. Hollywood wartime shorts also played their part. Training films showed US gunners how to identify the He-111, often exaggerating its menace. Animated propaganda caricatured it as a vulture swooping on innocent victims. These depictions gave the bomber a psychological power beyond its technical reality. Even within the military, symbolism mattered. Intelligence bulletins often described Heinkel raids, even when multiple aircraft types were involved, reinforcing the idea that the He-111 was the Luftwaffe's primary hammer. For American recruits, learning to fear and then defeat it became part of psychological preparation for war. The bomber's symbolism ultimately backfired on Germany. By elevating the He-111 in propaganda, America turned it into a propaganda weapon of its own, proof of Nazi barbarism, but also evidence that US forces could and would defeat the machines that once terrorized Europe. But if you believe propaganda was the end of the story, the He-111's lasting memory in America will surprise you even more, so make sure you watch till the end. By war's end, the Heinkel He-111 was no longer a cutting-edge terror in American eyes. Instead, it became a symbol of persistence, an aircraft that had carried Germany's early war hopes but ultimately been outclassed. Its legacy in America transformed from fearsome adversary to fascinating relic. Captured. He-111s were shipped to the United States, tested at facilities like Wright Field, and even flown in evaluation flights. American engineers praised its rugged construction but noted its obsolescence compared to late-war bombers. Pilots who flew the captured aircraft often described it as solid, steady, but uninspiring. For veterans, memories of the He-111 carried mixed emotions. Fighter pilots recalled it as a target that could be deadly in numbers, but was satisfying to shoot down. Bomber crews remembered it as part of the Luftwaffe's arsenal that harassed them, but gradually faded in prominence. Among civilians, it remained the shadowy face of the Blitz, a reminder of when Europe's skies burned. In post-war years, historians debated its importance. Some argued it had been decisive in the early campaigns. Others saw it as a workhorse overshadowed by more advanced designs. American aviation enthusiasts came to view it less as a nightmare and more as a case study in design compromise. Today, surviving, He-111s sit in museums, often mistaken by casual viewers for airliners due to their sleek profiles. In America, the bomber is remembered less for technical brilliance and more for symbolism. It was the aircraft that taught Americans to take the Luftwaffe seriously, the machine that bridged fear and resilience. From threat to curiosity, the He-111's legacy endures, not as a champion, but as a lesson carved into history. The Heinkel He-111 began as a sleek enigma and ended as a battered relic. To America, it symbolized both the terror of modern war and the resilience needed to overcome it. Once feared as the shadow of the Blitz, it was ultimately remembered as a workhorse that couldn't outlast history's tide. Its story reveals how perception shapes warfare and how legacy outlives performance.